सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
As we've been telling you through this week of the crisis and the war in Israel and around Israel, that a lot of that goes on, a lot of the violence that goes on, the fighting that goes on, the wars that go on, or the dirty little wars that go on in the Middle East are actually in the nature of proxy wars. For example, if you see what's happening in Yemen, what's been happening in Yemen for quite some time now, it's one of those forgotten wars. In fact, one of these days I was thinking that occasionally we'll start featuring these forgotten wars once in a while. So if you look at Yemen, Yemen is a battle or a war not between two Yemenis factions. It is a war, it's a proxy war. What's happening in Yemen is a proxy war between the Iranian power and the Saudi Gulf power. It can be Saudi plus UAE backed by the Americans. So it's a proxy war. That's one example. We are not going there right now. In the course of time, one of these days we might. Similarly, this theater of the most intense of these proxy wars and multiple proxy wars happens to be Syria. Syria is also a country crucially to the northeast of Israel. A large part of Syrian territory Israel occupied and has annexed. That is the Golan Heights territory. It's a high plateau. It's of great strategic importance. Israel occupied it in the 1967 war. Syria nearly would have succeeded in taking it back if the Israelis had not reacted early enough in 1973, but Israelis did then respond quite effectively and kept it. Now they have formally annexed it. Since then, Israel and Syria have had an uneasy relationship. They continue to be, since 1948, they continue to be in a state of war, and that state of war, the latest evidence has come today as the Israelis have gone and bombed Damascus airport and also Aleppo airport. Now, if you go and Google Israel bombings, Damascus airport and Aleppo airport, it's almost as if the Israeli Air Force has shuttles running to Aleppo and Damascus airport, because every now and then it looks like they go and bomb those airports. So that has happened again now. In fact, even if you look at what's been happening this year, even this year in March, also in August, Israeli Air Force has gone and bombed the same two airports, Damascus and Aleppo. Also, it's a bit, I won't say funny, because war is never funny. People do get killed and people do get thrown out of their homes, lose their jobs, etc., etc. Wars are very destructive to the economy. They are destructive even when they don't particularly result in the loss of too many lives, as might be the case with some precision weapons use. It's also even particularly the case in the Israeli-Syrian situation, because the two countries are officially at war. At this point, Syria is too complex and too large for Israelis to get into a proper war with or to escalate things with. Syrian regime, the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad regime has problems of its own. It's been fighting a civil war or more than a civil war there for more than 13 years now. I will talk about a little bit of that now. It's a broken state, it's a failed state, where it looked like Bashar al-Assad was losing power after the Arab Spring in 2011. Lately, it looks like he's made a smart recovery, but with the help of Iranians and Russians. So once again, the same linkage. Iran, Russia, China. In this case, China is not involved, but Iran and Russia in Syria are not just actively involved, but also physically involved. Both Iran and Russia have assets in Syria, military assets in Syria, military and intelligence assets, with one difference. The Iranian assets are not fighting, that is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or IRGC. They have many installations and assets in Syria, particularly in parts of Syria that are bordering Lebanon. Why do they have them there? Because Iran's need for those installations and that route is critical, because that is the land route that Iran uses to keep resupplying Hezbollah rebels. Hezbollah are Shiite rebels, fully controlled, funded, guided by Iran. Hezbollah also is an Israel-specific group. Hezbollah pretty much controls southern Lebanon. Again, that borders Israel, and Hezbollah actively are a bigger nuisance for Israel than the rebels in the Syrian territories. So very often you will find that Israelis have actually been going inside Syria and bombing Iranian assets there. Iranian assets, sometimes they also attack Iranian convoys carrying weapons or ammunition for Hezbollah rebels. That's pretty much a routine thing. This goes on. No country escalates it. Iranians also make many protests. They make angry statements, but they don't escalate it. So in fact, I will share with you an article by Ethan Bonner of Bloomberg. And the article is headlined, How Iran and Israel Attack Each Other While Avoiding All-Out War. It is in that situation of no war, no peace, that any time there is trouble in Israel and it looks like the Palestinians are under pressure or there is violence in Israel, a few rockets will be lobbed from the Syrian side. That's more a way of the Syrian regime trying to show its own Arab supporters, its own Muslim supporters, and its own Palestinian supporters that they are also doing something. But you know what? This is like what is called as Nura Kushti, like one of those WWF fake wrestling matches. So they fire these rockets and these artillery shells in open ground perfectly with the intention of not hurting anybody. These don't hurt anybody, but that is precisely the intention. Similarly, the Israelis also fire back a few, so it looks like they are retaliating again with the intention of hurting nobody. So this Nura Kushti or this fake wrestling, sham wrestling goes on between the two countries. Otherwise, they maintained a fair bit of stability between the two of them. Now, what triggered this latest round of bombings? On Tuesday evening, reports came out that north of Israel was under massive attack. So there were rumors it was a drone attack, massive drone attack, or maybe it was a missile or rocket attack. And immediately, usual suspect, everybody thought, and even the Israelis thought initially, that this was the Hezbollah firing these from Lebanon. As it turned out, soon enough, nothing was coming in from Lebanon, but these gifts were actually from Hezbollah and Hezbollah-like groups or Iran-affiliated groups or Shiite groups based now not in Lebanon but in Syria. Now, how did these Hezbollah-like groups, Hezbollah and Hezbollah-like militias get into Syria? Because Syria is not essentially a Shiite country. Syria is a Sunni majority country. The ruling dynasty, however, the Alawites, might be described as being closer to Shias. In any case, when the rebellion took place in the Syrian army after 2011, in the course of the Arab Spring, the Syrian army is more than 2/3 Sunni. So the elements that broke away, what was called as FSA or Free Syrian Army, they were mostly Sunni. So to fight them and to protect the Bashar al-Assad regime, the Iranians helped by getting a lot of the Hezbollah rebels to move into Syria from adjoining areas in Lebanon to shore up the Bashar al-Assad regime. Now, many of them stayed back there, and Assad never minded it because for him, these were helpful. So Assad got these militias to help him. He got Russians to actively help him, including Russian Air Force in very large strength. In fact, a couple of Russian aircraft also got shot in that Russian-American melee, because for some time Americans were also there, at least sort of in the northern and eastern parts of Syria, which were abutting Turkey and Iraq, because they were fighting ISIS there. There was a time after 2011, as ISIS rose, that they acquired control of a large part of Syria. In fact, they acquired control of such a large part of Syria, and you can see it on this map how much of Syria did ISIS control, that in fact their idea of the caliphate had actually come into being in Syrian territory. That's where the Turks got involved, the Americans got involved, Assad was fighting, on Assad's side Russians were fighting, and the Iranians were fighting. So all these forces, inimical to each other at one point, were all fighting ISIS. In that melee, there were times when you might have seen that maybe the Israelis were sympathetic to ISIS and might be helping them a little bit because they were expecting ISIS to neutralize the Bashar al-Assad regime. Similarly, the Saudis at some point might have been sympathetic to ISIS as well. So this was a very messy situation. The Americans were there as long as ISIS survived, but in the course of time, ISIS were defeated. ISIS capital, in fact, was in Raqqa in Syria. That was liberated, as was the city of Mosul in Iraq. And ISIS then vanished as a geographical entity, geographical and geopolitical entity. As that happened, Americans began to lose their interest. Now, Americans had some debt of gratitude to Kurdish groups because they had helped the Americans fight ISIS. But at one point, Americans got tired of them also. In the Trump era, Americans completely pulled out, leaving the Kurds to their own devices. When that happened, SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, which was one of the larger, sort of more liberal, less Islamist groups of Kurds, of Kurdish militias, they joined hands with the Assad government. Now, a combination of all these forces, particularly the active involvement of the Russians, protected the Bashar al-Assad regime. Today, he is in control of most of his country, and it's widely acknowledged that he has won this war. He has won this war and he's there to stay. So much so that this May, after 13 years of being blackballed, after 13 years of being kept out of the Arab League, he was admitted back to the Arab League. So his mainstreamization started, even though in the US Congress and US policy making system, pressure on Assad continues. And there's a lot of popular support in the US political system to actually prevent Assad and Assad regime from getting normalized. So much so that a bunch of US congressmen even moved a law called the Assad Anti-Normalization Act. Because you know what? The more powerful and more stable that Assad gets, the bigger threat it could become to Israel, in which America has such a strong interest. So once again, Syria, a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian, diverse state, which had remained stable, albeit under a dictatorship, that was broken because of the Arab Spring. Now, one principle that followed the Arab Spring was that in countries where the army stayed loyal to the regime survived. In countries where the army broke away from the regime lost power. Libya, for example, the government lost power. In Egypt, the regime briefly lost power. There was an election, but then the army did not like who had come in and once again restored a kind of, in principle, it's status quo ante. So once again, we saw the rise of a former general as a dictator backed by the military in Egypt. It's only in countries, in all of the other countries where Arab Spring took place, where the army broke away from the regime fell. In Syria, however, the army broke away, part of the army broke away and set up what was called FSA, Free Syrian Army. Immediately, they made a lot of impact because they were well-trained people, they had their weapons, they were motivated, but as the mess grew, many of those units or subunits of Free Syrian Army joined ISIS. And once they joined ISIS, then they faced the full fury, not just of Bashar's army or what was left of Bashar's army, but also of the Americans, of the Turks, of everybody else. So they, in the course of time, got destroyed. What helped Assad also was the fact that from the west, from Lebanon, came these large forces of Hezbollah militias, Shia militias. So once again, it is Shia militias who backed Bashar al-Assad. At the same time, he was being backed by the Iranians, again a Shia power, fighting his Sunnis in a Sunni majority country, in a vast Sunni majority country, but also where Russia was involved in the war. Once again, what were the Russians doing there? What were the Iranians doing there? Iranians were fighting their proxy war against Israel and against Israel's main backer, Israel's main patron, that's America, in Syria, because they were not going to allow Syria fall into the hands of any powers that were either friendly to Israel or inimical to Iran or not aligned with Iran. And why were the Russians there? They were there fighting not just a proxy war in this case, but actually getting involved in a proxy war. They were helping a regime which has been a client state of the Soviet power and now is friendly with Russia, fight its own rebels to preserve its own power so that this bulwark of hostility to Israel and also to American power in the region remains. So once again, a bunch of proxy wars were taking place in Syria. I told you early on that a war is a very destructive thing, small or big, but Syria hasn't had a big war. Syria has had among the most destructive civil wars in our generation. Syria also is an unusual country where population declined very fast. Although it does look like this year they might have made a little bit of an improvement, but population declined very fast. Now population might be declining in Japan also, but that's different. That's for demographic reasons, because people are not producing babies and populations are getting old. And the rate of decline is there, but it's very low. In Syria, on the other hand, between 2010 and 2016, population had declined by 19%. That means almost 1 out of 5 Syrians were no longer there. Now, where did they go? A lot of them unfortunately died, and many more of them, in fact, many more of them left their country and became refugees. Now, how many Syrians have died in this civil war? Correct numbers, precise numbers, nobody knows, but you can see estimates. If I see estimates from all global publications, reputed publications, many with feet on the ground carrying out surveys or network there, the estimates in the civil war of Syrians dead, of dead Syrians, is 5 lakhs to 6.13 lakhs. Country that began with a population of 2 crores or 2.1 crores. In 2010, Syria's population was 2.11 crore. By 2011, already it was 1.83 crores. And then, until last year or so, when estimates were done, Syrians living in Syria were just about 1.7 crores. So population has declined that rapidly. So of this 6 lakh people, about 5 to 6 lakh people have died. Who are these people? Again, according to credible estimates, 2.5 lakh civilians, 1.75 lakh government combatants, those are members of the loyal Syrian army, and again about the same number, 1.75 lakhs anti-government combatants. And this is a civil war in which at least 4 foreign powers have been actively involved. Which 4? America, the big daddy; Russia, the second big daddy in this place; third, Turkey, the big brother next door; and fourth, Iran. Again, Iran, the most interested, and in Syria's case, the most helpful uncle, even if living a little bit of distance away. So all 4 powers have been fighting. People who've been dying have all been Syrians. It's in that situation that Bashar al-Assad finds himself. It's in that situation now that he has to deal with a fresh crisis. When Hamas launches these attacks in Israel, everybody knows Hamas's connections with Iran. So Assad also knows that this will activate Hezbollah rebels. In this case, they've begun to act not from Lebanese soil, but from his soil. That complicates Bashar al-Assad's life. Now, this little bit of exchange of rockets, etc., which hit nothing, has taken place. Israelis have carried out these air raids. From what we understand, mainly from Western media in this case, the government of UAE has got in touch with Bashar al-Assad, Syrian government, and asked them to lie low, that they should not get dragged into this war. Because, UAE now, after Abraham Accords, is a friend of Israel's to the extent that they now have diplomatic relations and they are improving their relationship. UAE is also a member of I2U2. It's one of the 2 U's in I2U2. I2U2 means India, Israel, USA and UAE. So UAE is part of that grouping. So UAE has a vested interest in Syria not getting involved or not escalating this war. Chances are that is the course that Bashar al-Assad will follow. But will then the Hezbollah rebels, who now have sanctuaries all over his territory, will they follow the same principle, or will they act in his interest, in Assad's interest, or in their own interest, or in their sponsoring principal's interest, that is Iran's interest? That is something we don't know. All we can say in conclusion is that what's playing out in Israel and around Israel right now is one more chapter in that giant proxy war, giant series of proxy wars, which is ultimately a war between Israel and Iran, with America on the one side and Russia and China on the other, lurking on the horizon.